Today's the start of Holy Week, also called Passion Week. Passion Week, you'll hear. The reason why some people call it Passion Week is because in the King James Bible, which is the 1611 version of the Bible that America used for hundreds of years, in the book of Acts starts off and it says, Jesus showed himself alive after his passion in many infallible proofs or something like that. And so it's just an old English word, passion, which means his sufferings. So if you say Passion Week, what you're actually saying is his suffering week. So you could call it his suffering week, Passion Week, that's fine. Or you could call it Holy Week. For the remainder of the service, I'll just call it Holy Week, but same thing. 7 days that changed the world. Palm Sunday, Furious Monday, Teaching Tuesday, Conspiracy Wednesday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Silent Saturday, and Resurrection Sunday. This is the most significant week of the greatest man who ever lived, the Lord Jesus Christ. The most significant week of the greatest man who ever lived. So this morning I got to thinking about weeks, and I thought about just the creation of the week. So when Jesus, the same Jesus that walked through all of these events in Holy Week, that same Jesus was the creator of heaven and earth. At the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1, when it says God created the heaven and the earth, we know that that was actually Jesus. John 1 tells us that. Hebrews 1 tells us that. Colossians 1 tells us that. It was Jesus. When Jesus created the heavens and the earth in Genesis, he created the sun and the moon to give us days, months, and therefore years, but not weeks. There's no scientific reason, there's no natural reason why our life is made up of weeks. Our life is made up of weeks, not because of nature. Our life is made up of weeks because of the wisdom of God. Because that's how he said it would be. And he ordained it in the very first week of creation. He said, this is how your humanity and human life will be experienced. In a cycle, yes, of days and months and years, but also in this regular rhythm of weeks. And societies all throughout history, every once in a while, have tried to change that. Create a 9-day week or a 14-day week or different things that societies have tried, but it's never worked. Because the wisdom of God is that humans, we live week to week. When the Lord created his own nation of people that he called Israel, a special nation for a special purpose. He created all the nations. He created all of humanity, but he chose Israel for a special purpose, to receive the law, to bring about the Messiah, and to declare his glory to the nations. When he created Israel, he said, I command you to get together several times a year for an entire week and to celebrate things. And so he built these holy days, these holiday rhythms into their life, and almost all of them were a week. Because there was something significant about taking a week to remember and celebrate the past, to unite around shared experiences in the present, and to look forward to and invoke the Lord's blessings for the future. So in these weeks that were significant throughout the year, there is this past, present, and future aspect. One of the weeks was called Passover. In fact, Holy Week was actually a holiday week called Passover Week. It was something that the Lord had instituted 1,500 years before. And every spring, all the Jews that would all come to Jerusalem, and they would celebrate for an entire week, past, present, and future. And then in the summer, they would come together 50 days later, and they would remember how the Lord gave the law, the 10 Commandments, on the 2 tablets of stone on the top of Mount Sinai. And Moses received those tablets, and they had the 10 Commandments there, which is this condensed version of the law. And so every summer, we call it Pentecost, they called it Shavuot, they would celebrate the giving of the law, and they would remember, and they would unify, and they would invoke the Lord's blessings for the future. And then every fall, they had Sukkot, which is the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. And they all built these little tents. Jake, you would have loved this. All the boys would have loved this, but I think I just thought of Jake. They built these little tents in their backyard, and you had to sleep in your backyard for 7 days. You couldn't sleep in your house. You had a house, and you had a bed, but you weren't allowed to sleep in it. You had to sleep in the tent you made in the outside. And why did you sleep in a tent for a week? Everybody in Israel had to sleep in a tent in their backyard for a week. Why? To remember that generations ago, our forefathers slept in a tent every single night for 40 years. And so they would relive that experience, and they would be thankful for their past. They would unite together as a community in the present, and they would invoke the Lord's blessings and look in anticipation to the future. That happened every fall, and then every winter, they had Hanukkah. They had the Hanukkah celebration. Now, this one didn't start in 1,500 years before. This one started just a couple hundred years before Jesus, less than 200 actually. But it was to celebrate when the Lord miraculously delivered the children of Israel from the Greeks, those evil Greeks, Antiochus Epiphanes, bad guy. And the Lord rescued them, and so they celebrate for 8 crazy nights, right? This is Hanukkah. The idea is that the Lord, in his wisdom, knew that my people need to stop and reset and focus their hearts and minds for a week solid on these pivotal experiences of the past, unite in the present, and look forward to the future. And Christians today, we typically don't celebrate those Jewish holidays. You can if you want, there's liberty, but we typically don't. But we have this week. This is a week, ever since the 2nd century, maybe 3rd century, for almost the entire life of the church, for over almost 2,000 years, Christians have paused on this day, Palm Sunday, and said, okay, we're going to take a week, and we're going to remember the most significant week of the greatest man who ever lived, who changed the world. Holy Week. More is written on this one week in the Bible than any other week in history. It's the most significant week of all time. To kind of show that, we only have 4 chapters about Christ's first 30 years. The first 30 years of his life, from little bitty baby Jesus to 30 years when he was baptized in the Jordan, we only have 4 chapters talking about 30 years of his life. However, this last week of his life, we have 30 chapters and 1,200 verses about this last week. It is the focus of Christ's life, are these 7 days. During Holy Week, not a wasted word was spoken, and not a wasted action was performed. Jesus was so deliberate walking through this week. Everything he said was measured by the Scriptures, measured by the Spirit. He had an eye and an ear to what the Father was saying and what the Father was doing, and everything was so premeditated and deliberate throughout this week. You can tell when you read it. He said during Passion Week, he said, the Father is not only telling me what to say, but how to say it. So not only was what he's saying being measured, but the way in which he said everything was being measured by the Father. That's in John chapter number 12, it says that. Over 60 Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled during this week. 60, over 60 that I can tell, maybe more, were fulfilled during this week. Now, I have been told by those close to me, specifically Pastor Ken, that I tend to oversell things. Have you heard this about me? Oversell, underdeliver. I'm a salesman by trade, and that is the trap of the salesman, is that I can oversell things, right? And so if you talk to Pastor Ken, he has 100 stories about how I've told him, this movie was the greatest action movie in the history of Hollywood. And then he saw it with that build-up, and it was such a letdown to him. And he's like, oh, Jerod, you ruined it, man. I've been told that I oversell things. However, I don't think it's possible to oversell Holy Week. It's the most significant week of the greatest life ever lived. If we think of weeks as personal experiences to every human being, for instance, if there's 50 of us in the room right now, then this week we will all experience, there will be 50 different weeks experienced this week. Because my week is going to be very different than Angela's week, right? And so while it's the same calendar, my week will look like this and her week will look like this, okay? So 2 people, 2 different weeks of experience. With that logic, if you take how many weeks have been experienced in the history of humanity, my best guess, as I did some math, was 300 trillion. Taking a young Earth perspective of how many human beings have lived, and you take however many human beings have lived, you multiply that by the average number of years, you multiply that by 52 weeks, and you get this number. And the number is 300 trillion. 300 trillion weeks experienced throughout the history of the world. And what I'm asserting this morning is that Holy Week is the greatest week of them all. Is that an over-exaggeration? I don't think so. Here we go. Let me prove it to you. All right, the greatest week, and so I have just a few greatest things here just to get us ready for this awesome week of Holy Week. So in Holy Week, we see the greatest act of prophetic worship. We meditated upon it this morning, but the day before Palm Sunday, on Saturday night, Mary of Bethany is sitting in her brother's house, Lazarus, who is raised from the dead, and she sees all the 12 apostles sitting around Jesus, and in a moment, she gets prompted to go into her bedroom and to grab this very, very costly bottle of perfume. Some say it's something, in today's value, it would be something like $50,000 bottle of perfume, which doesn't make any sense to us. But anyway, maybe it was her dowry or something like that, but a $50,000 bottle of perfume, maybe her entire life savings to that point. And she came and she broke the whole thing and anointed Christ for his burial. You see, Christ would die on Friday. This is on Saturday night. Christ would die the next Friday, and he would die in such a way and at such a time where they wouldn't have time to anoint his body for burial. And so she anointed his body early. But it was a prophetic act, and it was prophetic worship. Jesus said, I'm going to die, and it seems to be that Mary of Bethany was the only one who believed him. And she says, well, if that's going to happen in the future, well, then I'm going to proclaim my belief in your words now, and I'm going to anoint your body now for when you'll die later on this week. Prophetic worship. That last song that you all sang, I thought that is the perfect spirit of Mary of Bethany. That last song was just, it felt like that's something Mary would be singing. It was so great. Number 2, in Holy Week, we see the greatest prophetic word ever delivered, and I'm going to say that that's the Olivet Discourse. So on Tuesday, on Teaching Tuesday, Jesus is walking with his disciples, and they're walking past the temple in Jerusalem, and the guys say, Jesus, would you look at those stones, how they shine? And he said, not one stone will be left upon another in one generation. And like Peter, James, John, and Andrew took him aside later and were like, hey, can you talk to us more about that? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Where's the temple going? And so then he gives this prophetic sermon about how in 40 years later, the Romans would come in and would sack and destroy the city. But it wasn't just a prophetic word about what was going to happen 40 years later. He weaved in it, in the most amazing way, what's going to happen when he returns the second time at the end of the age. So he took a near event and a far event, his own return one day, and he fused them together in this prophetic word that the church has been poring over for 2,000 years. And it gets clearer and clearer as the time approaches to when Christ comes back. But we won't fully be able to parse out those two distinctions until he comes back. I think it's the greatest prophetic word ever delivered. Next, we see the greatest exposition of Old Testament scriptures in Holy Week. So this is on the road to Emmaus. On Sunday, Jesus appears to 2 forlorn disciples who were disappointed with God. Have you been there? I've been there before when you're just disappointed with God. They were disappointed with God, and Jesus came alongside them. He just kind of walked out of the bushes, and he joined them. Like, where'd you come from? He said, oh, don't worry about it. I'm just here. He said, what are you guys so sad about? And when they said, well, because the guy we were following, this Rabbi Jesus, we thought he was the Messiah, but now he's dead, and he's gone like the rest of them. And Jesus said, you hard-hearted fools. Let me give you a Bible lesson. And it says Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So he took out his Old Testament and he says, guys, let's start from the beginning. Let me tell you where I am throughout this entire book. And he went through Genesis, and he went through Genesis 1 as creator probably, Genesis 3 as the one promised to crush the head of the serpent at the fall, Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac. We just saw the movie this weekend, His Only Son, right, about Abraham and Isaac. Certainly Jesus brought that up, and he was able to go through one book after another, the greatest expositional sermon of all time by Jesus himself, preached during Holy Week. During Holy Week, we see the greatest intercessory prayer ever prayed. The greatest intercessory prayer ever prayed. Jesus was an intercessor on the earth, and he is an intercessor right now. That's what he ever lives to do in the heavens. Right now, if you could look up into the sky and see past the purlins, and see past the planks, and see past the rubber roof, and see past the clouds, and see past all of it, and into the Spirit, you would see Jesus in high priestly garment, unlike any man you've ever seen before. He's glorious and brilliant with eyes of fire. John describes him in Revelation chapter number 1. Looks absolutely magnificent. But quickly, after you were to see him, you would begin to hear him. And what you would hear him doing is you'd hear him interceding on behalf of his people. He ever lives to make intercession for us. He talks to the Father about you. When you pray about health concerns and when you pray about all the concerns of your life, Jesus takes your prayers and he rehearses them into the ears of the Father. It's what he does constantly. And he interceded all throughout his life on earth, but then he made sure to give an intercessory prayer in the company of his men, and John heard it and wrote it down, and it's recorded in John 17. It's the greatest intercessory prayer ever prayed the night before Christ died, and we're privileged enough to have it in print. That's during Holy Week. During Holy Week, we see the greatest summary of God's laws. The greatest summary of God's laws. There's 613 laws in the Old Testament that the Jews had to observe. And a lawyer walked up to Jesus during Holy Week and he said, I got a riddle for you. What's the greatest of all the commandments? What's the greatest of all 613? Pick one if you can. And they were going to try to trip him up. And he said, Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. He took 613 and he beautifully and succinctly distilled them down to two. And these two have been the true north of the church for 2,000 years. What he did in serving us in that way, in making sure that was recorded, and in summarizing it like that. It takes this burden of God's law that sometimes we can feel because of misintentioned preachers, this burden of God's law, and it completely removes it. And he says, wait, just two? Just two things? Love God with everything and love other people like I love myself? Well, I think I can do that, right? It's so approachable. It's so wise. It's the greatest summary of God's laws declared during Holy Week. Next, we see the greatest mystery revealed. The greatest mystery of the universe is, what do you think is the greatest mystery of the universe? Well, you have my opinion. You have your opinion, I have mine. My opinion, that the greatest mystery of the universe is the mystery of the Trinity. How is one God, three persons? One being, three persons. How does that work? Father, Son, and Spirit. The Father is not the Son is not the Father is not the Spirit, the Son is not the Spirit, but yet they're all God? The Trinity. It was never revealed in the Old Testament. Jesus revealed it, and he revealed it in his last night on earth. The last night on earth. The Jews, they had never heard anything like this before. The mystery of the Trinity was revealed in the incarnation of Christ, and he waited till his last day on earth to say, all right, guys, you want to know the greatest mystery of the universe? Here we go. And it's recorded in John 14, 15, and 16. He said it at the Last Supper table where he explained how one God can exist in three persons. We see the greatest condemnation of the religious spirit in Holy Week. The greatest condemnation of the religious spirit. Matthew 23 is like holy ground. You know when you see one person chew somebody else out? You ever been in the room when like all of a sudden somebody snaps on somebody else and you're like, ooh, that's too... I didn't know I was going to be here for that. Couldn't you have waited till I left the room? Like, that was really harsh. I really feel awkward now. I've been in that scenario many times in my life. And I feel that every time I read Matthew 23. It's called the seven woes, but it is Jesus absolutely blasting the religious spirit in the Pharisees. And it is hot. He said things like, you crush people with unbearable religious demands. You are like whitewashed tombs. Oh, you're beautiful on the outside, but on the inside you are full of dead men's bones. You cross land and sea to make one convert, and then what do you do with that convert? You go all around the world to make one convert, and then what do? You turn that convert into twice the child of hell that you are. You brood of vipers, you snakes. How will you escape the judgment of hell? Whew. That's a Holy Week conversation. How does Jesus feel about about the religious spirit? Not about religious people, about the religious spirit, about the demonic spirit behind what the Pharisees were doing. Matthew 23 is how he feels about that. Thank you, Holy Week. Next, we see the greatest betrayal ever performed. The greatest betrayal. Judas Iscariot betrayed Christ with a kiss. Betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. It's the greatest betrayal that has ever been performed. We see the greatest mockery ever done. So, God left his throne. On his throne, he wore a crown. He left his throne in the heavens. He came down to be one of us. And then his life ends with people putting a crown of thorns on his head, right? Pushing it into a skull, putting a fake scepter in his hand, and putting a purple cloth around him like it was a robe, and mocking him and spitting on him. What mockery. The greatest mockery ever happened during Holy Week. The greatest act of torture. The Romans had perfected the art of torture. The Jews, they were somewhat civilized in their torture. Like they had a rule. If you're going to beat somebody with a rod, 40 is too many. You can go up to 39, but you can never beat somebody with a rod 40 times. That was a rule in the law because they were somewhat civilized. Not the Romans. Not civilized whatsoever, right? They didn't use rods. They used cat o' nine tails that had glass and bone and metal in it, and they'd whip the body, tear the flesh out. More often than not, when they scourged people with cat o' nine tails, it would disembowel them or they would die just because they would bleed out right there. Jesus didn't. He endured it, and he ended up dying on the cross. But probably one reason why he died so quickly on the cross was because the cat o' nine tails beating was so awful. It's the greatest act of torture, I think probably in the history of humanity. The greatest injustice ever performed. Every other injustice throughout all of history is seen in light of this injustice. I've heard some people say this little pithy statement, why do bad things happen to good people? You ever hear that? Why do bad things happen to good people? And like this funny response is, that only happened once, and he signed up for it, right? There's only one good person to ever live, that's Jesus. Something bad happened to him, but he volunteered for it. Other than that, there are no good people. And I know that's probably insensitive in a lot of different cases. But Jesus is the only truly innocent man who ever lived. The only truly innocent man who ever lived was Jesus. He never sinned. And yet he was found guilty for crimes he didn't commit and then executed brutally for them. It's the greatest injustice in all the world. The greatest generational curse ever invoked on a people. My stomach turns every time I read it. Every time I read it. Here Jesus is. He's already been scourged. He's standing in this big open space, this like open courtroom, and Pilate, the Roman, is there, and Jesus is standing there, and all the Jews are there. Many Jews are there in front of him, including the leaders of the Jewish people. And so Jesus is here. Pilate is here, standing there, talking to the crowd. And then this famous criminal named Barabbas is here. And they're trying to negotiate, who are we going to let go? We're going to let Barabbas go or let Jesus go? And they said, crucify Jesus, crucify Jesus. And Pilate said, what has he done? And he said, I'm washing my hands of this guy. Because even Pilate knew there's nothing wrong with Jesus. He hasn't done anything wrong, so he washes his hands. And the Jews begin to cry out. They invoke the greatest generational curse that has ever been placed on a people, and it came true 40 years later. What they said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. They invoked the death of Christ, the unjust death of Christ, the guilt of murdering the God-man. They invoked that upon the lives of their children. And their children were the ones that 40 years later had to endure the massacre that the Romans brought in 70 AD. The greatest generational curse ever brought upon a people. In Holy Week, we see the greatest plot twist ever. The greatest plot twist ever. So you see you see Pilate and the Romans. You see Herod and the Jews. You see Satan and his minions doing work like moving in Caiaphas' heart and entering into Judas, one of Jesus' own inner circle guys. And so you see politics and religion and Satan all working together for this one conspiracy, right? For this one thing to get Jesus killed, to shut him up and to kill him. And so they exhaust every effort they can, right? The Jews make a mockery of their justice system. It's called a kangaroo court, where it's a joke of what they did to try Jesus. It's a joke. The Romans used all of their brutal beating, and then Satan conspired the best that he could. He pulled out his biggest guns to kill him, and yet in his death, he birthed life for the whole world, and he made an open show of their powers, and he conquered them. It's the greatest plot twist ever, right? What they were trying to do ended up being the thing that would destroy their evil. Hallelujah. The greatest plot twist ever of any story. You see, let's see here. How about this one? The greatest meal ever eaten. Holy Week includes the greatest meal ever eaten. Ever. If any of you have seen or heard the story Hamilton, there's this famous song in the play Hamilton called The Room Where It Happened. You heard that before? You know what I'm talking about when I say The Room Where It Happened? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we got a couple. So The Room Where It Happened is this song in Hamilton where they talk about how this time when James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton all got together for a private secret dinner in which they negotiated with Alexander Hamilton to get the capital city of America, the capital, moved from New York down to the Potomac, down to Washington, D.C. And it was this private backroom discussion, and it was shrouded with such mystery, and they came out and they had made this decision, and everyone's like, oh, I wish I had been in the room when it happened. Like when that happened, when that negotiation went down, what I would have done to be in the room. And the song is kind of built around that. All right. The room where it happened. The room where Jesus confirms the new covenant, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet, where Jesus has the Last Supper, where Jesus unveils the mystery of the Trinity. It's the greatest meal ever eaten, and it happened on Thursday night of Passion Week. It's the greatest act of servant leadership when Jesus, the God-man, got down on his knees and he washed the feet of the disciples. And not only the 11 who would love him, but he washed Judas's feet. He washed his betrayer's feet, knowing that just hours from then, he'd be betraying him. He knew it the whole time. He knew who he was. He talked about it at the dinner. But he washed his feet before he excused him from the room. The greatest act of servant leadership ever. The greatest act of restraint is in Holy Week. When Judas did come to betray him, Jesus looks at his men. His men says, are we going to fight back? And he says, fight back? No, I need to be arrested. And he says, besides, guys, I don't need you and your little swords. He said, if I wanted to, right now, I could call 12 legions of angels, and they would come and rescue me right now. That's 72,000 angels. I could call on 72,000 angels, and they would come and rescue me, but no, that's not what this moment's about. In that, I see the greatest act of restraint. A man who had all power in heaven and in earth, yet didn't use it for our sake. I see the greatest expression of God's name ever in that scene leading up to his arrest. It says that a great multitude of Roman soldiers came out to meet him after he had prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him. A great multitude of Roman soldiers came out. And Jesus said, here we go, guys. They're coming, and so we're going to go meet our hour. And so he comes up, and he says, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth, a whole multitude of Roman soldiers. And Jesus responds with 2 words. He said, I am. And at the declaration of I am, which is the basis for God's name Yahweh, I am is the basis for God's name Yahweh. It's what the Lord revealed in the burning bush when Moses said, who should I say sent me? Who are you, God, in this burning bush? And he said, I am the I am. I am. So Jesus said, they said, who are you looking for? Jesus said, who are you looking for? They said, Jesus of Nazareth said, I am. And immediately, the entire Roman army that was there all flew back onto their butts, not knowing what in the world just happened to them. That's what it says. You can read it in John chapter number 18. It says they all flew back and fell on their backs like a wind, like some powerful force just pushed him back. And they all got up and he said, who are you looking for again? And then he said, okay, I'm done playing. Go ahead and take me, guys, right? He's messing with him. The greatest expression of God's name as soldiers went flying back at the mere declaration of I am. Come on. In Holy Week, we see the greatest demonstration of courage and faith. He said that in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was suffering intense agony. Such intense agony that blood was seeping out of his body, right? Hematidrosis. Blood was seeping out of his body because he knew what was about to come, and yet he stood up, and with courage and faith, like Todd Beamer. Remember Flight 93? Todd Beamer from 9/11? What did Todd Beamer say? Let's roll. That's right. Todd Beamer looked at the hijackers. He knew what was going to happen if he stormed that cockpit. He knew he would die, and he knew the plane would go down, right? Flight 93. But he said, this is the moment. This is what the moment calls for. Let's roll. I get goosebumps when I hear Todd's story, when I listen to that from 9/11, when I listen to that audio because it is recorded. But it's nothing like the goosebumps I get when I see Jesus stand up. He's got bloody slime all over his body because he's under that much stress. And he looks over at his men. He goes, let's go. My betrayer is at hand. And he walks to bear the weight of the whole world. Come on. The greatest demonstration of courage and faith. I'm almost done. The greatest demonstration of forgiveness, by which every act of forgiveness for 2,000 years has been measured, right? As he hung upon the cross, he looked at the men who were killing him, and what did he say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know. They think they know. They're angry, right? They're doing what they're told. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know. They're being led by a power that they know not of. And so, Father, forgive those men. And every act of forgiveness by every Christian for the last 2,000 years has been done with the backdrop of Jesus hanging on the cross saying, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. It's the greatest demonstration of forgiveness in the history of mankind. We see the greatest attestation of his divinity happen the moment that he died. The moment that he died, I think 4 things happened all at the same time. The sun went dark. That's to show that God's judgment is on this moment. The sun went dark. We have a great earthquake. Earthquakes, not a good thing. The veil of the temple, the curtain in the temple that was something like 30 feet high and like 6 or 7 inches thick, all of a sudden miraculously just cut down the middle, symbolizing that the way to God was now available to all who believe in Jesus. It was this great miraculous symbolic act. So the sun goes dark, the earth quakes, the veil is torn, and at that moment, the one performing the execution of Jesus, the centurion carrying out the execution, the Roman guard, looked up and he said, surely this man is the Son of God. Talk about an attestation. Talk about a testimony. Mark made sure he recorded that one. He's like, a lot of things were said this week. We're going to make sure this one gets in there, right? We're going to put it in there twice maybe. We see the greatest demonstration of love. Think about Nicodemus, right? Preston and I were talking about the Nicodemus story this week. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Greater love has no one than this, than that a man lay down his life for his friends. How much more than when a man lays down his life for the world? The greatest demonstration of love. And it happened during Holy Week. 3 more. We see the greatest demonstration of humility, surrender, sacrifice, and obedience. The greatest. He who was in the form of God did not think it robbery to be equal with God, but he made himself of no reputation. He humbled himself and took upon him the form of a servant and became obedient unto death, even the death on a cross. Humility, surrender, sacrifice, and obedience. If you want to just bring all that into one symbol, it's that symbol right there, right? That's it. It's humility, surrender, sacrifice, obedience, love, power, and every other good virtue of God is displayed right there, right? That's Holy Week. The greatest victory ever won. I'm glad Victor's here to hear this. The greatest victory ever won. In his life, Jesus made sure to deliberately overcome the world, the flesh, and the devil. The world, the flesh, and the devil. We can find out throughout his life that he overcame the world, and the flesh, and the devil in a variety of different ways. You can go to his temptation in the wilderness and see that the 3 temptations were all about offering him the world, offering him the gratification of the flesh, and offering him, well, satanic power. Satan said, I'll give you my power. So in his flesh and in his life and in the wilderness, he overcame the world, the flesh, and the devil. And on the cross, he overcame the other big 3. Sin, death, and hell. So with these 6 overcome, he gets the victor's crown. And so that's why if you were to see him in heaven today, like we see in Revelation 19, when he comes back, he has many crowns on. Many crowns on, right? Because he is the victor. The world, the flesh, and the devil. Sin, death, and hell. And that's why when he came back to John in Revelation chapter number 1, he had talked about the keys of the kingdom in Matthew 16, right? He looked at Peter and he said, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom as a leader in my church. Come on. Jesus has the keys of the kingdom. He can give them to Peter. And now with John, in Revelation chapter number 1, he says, not only do I have the keys of the kingdom, but now I have the keys of death and hell. And I own them and they're mine because I'm the victor who overcame the world, the flesh, and the devil, sin, death, and hell. The greatest victory ever won. And lastly, the greatest revelation of God the world has ever seen. The greatest revelation of God the world has ever seen. What's God like? Let me tell you about Holy Week. Let me walk you through. It's a lot. It's 1,200 verses. It's 30 chapters. But it's the last week of the most significant life ever lived by the greatest man who ever lived. And when you see Jesus in Holy Week and you hear his words, and you follow him around Jerusalem. You follow him back to Bethany and back to Jerusalem and back to Bethany and back to Jerusalem. You follow him through his trials and through his arrest and his scourging. You listen to you listen to what he said. You see how he acted. And that'll tell you what God is like. Because Jesus Christ is the express image of God. All the fullness of the Godhead bodily dwells in him. If you've seen him, you've seen the Father. If you can see Jesus in Holy Week this week, you'll see the Father. You'll see the heart of the Father. You'll see the motivations of the Father. You want to see the Father? Look at Jesus. And I think the best place to look at Jesus is in the passages of Holy Week.